Welcome to EPG Pathshala. Today I am going to talk to you about human rights discourse and education in India. This is Manjunath, working as a lecturer in the subject of Sociology in the Department of Pre-University Education, Bangalore. In this module, the human rights discourse and education in India is a part of the paper named Education and Society in the subject of Sociology. In the 21st century, the discourse on human rights has found a significant place in social science. Providing space for and protecting rights of human beings has been the fundamental duty of all modern nation states. Today, with increasing social tensions created by extremism and various forms of exploitation, it has become impossible for governments to provide and protect human rights all by themselves. There is a need for other basic social institutions to participate in this process, and also education has the major responsibility for inculcating in individuals the spirit of respecting the rights of others. The role of education in inculcating the knowledge of human rights is critical. In this context, both governments and civil society institutions have made many attempts at evolving educational policies and programs to keep the human rights discourse alive in India. With this background, an attempt is made in this module to give a conceptual understanding of human rights besides analyzing the impact of human rights discourse on the educational system in India and the attempts made by governments to incorporate human rights perspective in the curriculum. Before attempting to understand what constitutes human rights, it is important to know that the concept of human right originated in ancient civilization, particularly among the Greeks. Aristotle examined human rights in a political context. He explained that human rights spring from the bond that exists between men and the created state. Because right is the principal order in a political system. According to Aristotle, man is both a social and political animal. It is but natural that every human being desires power. Therefore, a system of rights is needed for a government to work for protecting people's common interests. Freedom is guaranteed only if there are rights. Aristotle's conception of human rights persists even today. The term human rights refers to those rights that are considered universal to humanity, regardless of citizenship, residency status, ethnicity, gender, or other considerations. Many a time, human rights have also been called fundamental rights. The fundamental rights that humans have by the fact of being human are neither created nor can be abrogated by any government. For the first time, the term human rights was systematically defined by the Scottish philosopher John Locke. According to him, human rights are absolute moral claims or entitlements to life, liberty, and property. The Virginia Declaration of Rights of 1776 proclaims all men are by nature equally free and independent and have certain inherent rights, of which when they enter a state of society they cannot by any compact deprive or divest their posterity. Thus, human rights are the rights inherent in all human beings. Human rights are commonly understood as inalienable fundamental rights to which a person is inherently entitled, simply because he or she is a human being. Therefore, human rights are conceived as universal and egalitarian. Further, these rights may exist as natural rights or as legal rights in local, regional, national, and international laws. There were no significant efforts made to formalize and give recognition for human rights worldwide until the 1940s. But after the atrocities of Second World War that resulted in large-scale loss of human lives and resources, concern for human rights grew, particularly through the United Nations. The fundamental basis for human rights was given by the United Nations and its Charter. Since the beginning of the foundation of United Nations, there have been many conventions and organizations, political parties and treaties which shaped the human rights discourse as well as practice. The United Nations Charter acts as the constitutional body for enforcement of laws and treaties for protection of human rights at an international level. After the United Nations Conference on International Organization, the Charter of United Nations, which contains 70 articles, was signed in 1945 in San Francisco. This is an obligatory agreement applicable to the members of United Nations. The preamble of the United Nations Charter grants essential base for member countries to reassure fundamental human rights to women and men equally. In order to give human rights further recognition, the United Nations brought out the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was accepted by the General Assembly of UN in 1948. It can be regarded as the embodiment of common standards to be adopted for achievement of human rights. The Declaration lays down the fundamental rights that are applicable to all people in the world. It is not a legally binding document, but it places responsibility on the member countries to incorporate specifications in their laws and constitutions. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights contains 30 articles. All these articles state that member countries should promote human, social, civil, and economic rights. Since the adoption of the Charter and the Declaration, many conventions and conferences have been organized to uphold human rights throughout the world. Some of the major conventions are the Geneva Convention, the International Convent on Civil and Political Rights, the International Convent on Social, Economic, and Cultural Rights, United Nations Convention against Torture, Convention on the Rights of the Child, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, United Nations Human Rights Council. Since India is a signatory to United Nations treaties on human rights, it is but natural that the country has been addressing the human rights issue very seriously. There are significant provisions in the Constitution in order to protect human rights. It is more often said, particularly by human rights organizations and social activists, that in India the human rights of marginalized are constantly denied and violated since they continue to suffer exploitation and violence. In India, the current notion of human rights can be found in the works of Mahatma Gandhi, B.R. Ambedkar, Arvind Ghosh, and others. The colonial encounters with Indians resulted in violation of human rights on many occasions, and the emergence of human rights perspective is rooted in the ideas and struggles against the dominance. However, systematic development in efforts at providing and protecting human rights dates back to the period after independence. The Indian Constitution is rooted in the principles which directed the Indian freedom movement in opposition to the British rule, during which human rights of the native Indian population were continuously under attack. Along with freedom struggle, the socio-reform movements which resulted in the abolition of social evils such as sati system, child marriage, and also upheld the rights of the widows, etc., could be treated as the beginning of the human rights movement in India. Further, backward caste movements and Dalit movements also gave an impetus for protection of human rights, all of which greatly impacted the Constitution. In the Constitution of the preamble, the fundamental rights and the directive principles of state policy portray the essential of human rights. Social inequality is a condition where resources are distributed unevenly because of unequal access and utilization of opportunities for leading a life of dignity. In a severely stratified society, resources and power are always unequally distributed. It is this inherent inequality that results in suppression of human rights. In India, the roots of social inequality mainly lie in such factors as caste, class, region, religion, and gender, among others. For many centuries, human rights of scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, women, and children are being constantly violated. Thus, the Constitution of India protects human rights of all the citizens and especially those of the vulnerable groups through various provisions. In recent years, with increasing advancement in information technology, which in turn has resulted in growing awareness of human rights, there have been many human rights movements in India, spearheaded by both civil society groups and individuals. These include movements to safeguard the rights of Dalits, tribals, women, landless labor, and victims of ecological damage and deforestation, and developmental projects that are unmindful of livelihood issues. The genesis of human rights movement in India can be traced back to the era of emergency. Since then, groups such as peasants, civil rights activists, women's organizations, trade unions, and others have been keeping the human rights debate alive. Education is not just expected to provide facts and knowledge to pupils, but also help in the development of wholesome personality. In particular, education system brings awareness on human rights, their importance, and imparts the skills by which human rights have to be respected. As John Dewey says, School is a model of good society. Thus, educational systems are the first place where human rights can be respected, inculcated, supported, and protected. Human rights education can be defined as education, training, and information aiming at building a universal culture of human rights through the sharing of knowledge, imparting skills, and molding of attitudes directed to the strengthening of respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, the full development of human personality and the sense of dignity. To emphasize the importance for human rights education, the United Nations declared the decade of 1995 to 2004 as United Nations Decade for Human Rights Education, which is a significant step in the direction of incorporating human rights education in the curriculum worldwide. Through the declaration, the United Nations promoted the interdependence and universality of human rights along with other rights. The United Nations in 2004 announced the World Programme for Human Rights Education to carry forward the initiative that it had already taken in the direction of making human rights education a part of mainstream educational process. This global program aimed at spreading the culture of human rights and also evolving a collective framework for spreading the message of human rights through education in all its member countries. Even though the work in developing knowledge on human rights in India was started with the formation of University Grants Commission in 1980s, more structured and systematic work in this direction began around in 1995. The impetus for this came from the establishment of the National Council for Teacher Education. The Council had organized orientation programs for teachers on human rights. At a later stage, emphasis on incorporating human rights in school curriculum was given in the National Curriculum Framework 2005. And through programs, it was accepted that human rights education provides protection from discrimination, unfair treatment, and undemocratic attitude, deterioration of cultural values, and abuses of human rights at any level. After independence, various commissions have been appointed and policies enacted from time to time to review the educational system and to give suggestions for development of meaningful system of education. The major commissions or policies that impacted the system of education were the University Education Commission, Secondary Education Commission of D.S. Kothari, National Policy on Education, Draft National Policy on Education, and other national policy of educations. Finally, Right to Education Act. All these reports of these committees invariably highlighted the importance of the right of education as a human right and also the role of education in human rights as an endeavor to transform the educational system. Curriculum is broadly defined as the totality of student experiences that occur in the educational process. The process of curriculum planning, formulating policy, implementation, and evaluation is called curriculum development. Change is the law of nature. Every society changes over a period of time. So is the case with educational curriculum. Hence, revitalization of curriculum has to be a constant process and has to incorporate changes taking place in the society. In developing a curriculum, the human rights dimension must not be added in a detached manner, but built into as many courses subjects as possible. elements of human rights should be incorporated into the educational system through the curriculum, because curriculum development is the most significant step in human rights education for schools, colleges and universities. The major objectives of human rights education are four, mainly: increase the knowledge and understanding of human rights, promote attitudes of tolerance, solidarity and integration, bring awareness of human rights, develop skills to protect human rights. In imparting human rights education, it is the interdisciplinary approach that needs to be applied. Also, both curricular and co-curricular activities have to be carried out in schools or colleges settings to impart human rights education. As mentioned earlier, human rights education need not only necessarily be treated as a separate subject, but its various dimensions need to be incorporated wherever it is possible and feasible. At different and diverse levels, human rights education can be imparted through such themes as constitution, national integration, tolerance of dissent and diversity, livelihood rights, secularism, sustainable environmental management, entitlement of marginalized groups, etc. In fact, in almost every subject, it is possible to bring the human rights angle if a teacher could apply his or her imagination. The most important aspect, however, is the concern which a teacher has for integrating the human rights approach in the teaching learning process. Human rights perspective could be incorporated into the curriculum in the three ways. First one is the formal curriculum, second the informal curriculum, third the hidden curriculum. The Right to Education Act as a human right. The Indian Parliament in 2009 passed the Right to Education Act, which describes the modalities of provision of free and compulsory education for children in the age group 6 to 14 years in India under the Article 21A of the Indian Constitution. From 1st April 2010, India became one of the 135 countries to make education a fundamental right of every child. The right to education is a universal entitlement to education, a right that is recognized as a human right. According to the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the right to education includes the right to free, compulsory primary education for all, an obligation to make secondary education accessible to all, in particular by the progressive introduction of free secondary education, as well as an obligation to develop equitable access to higher education, ideally by the progressive introduction of free higher education. To conclude that, even though National Curriculum Framework suggested that human rights education must be integrated in the teacher education framework, many of the existing teacher education programs do not reflect this vision. Most teacher trainees do not get a chance to familiarize themselves with the concepts relating to human rights in their course content as well as in their school activities. It is only when teachers understand how to incorporate the principles of human rights in the curriculum and its transaction, human rights education can be meaningfully imparted. If human rights awareness among students is to be achieved, we need to orient our teachers first. Thus, ideally, it must be started from the pre-program level itself. The number of human rights violations is increasing day by day in India as well as in other countries. After pursuing the available data sources in the field of human rights and human rights education, it is evident that human rights education in India is still in an infant stage. But if due attention is not paid to this aspect, at least now, our education system will continue to remain indifferent to the issue of rights and entitlements.